Hello, I'm a very busy boy, and the Lord has given me 4 books of my heart, and written 2 of them. One is still a little bit far away, but I'm embarking on the third, and it's the content of the third one that's really sort of going through my mind, and I'd say sort of not worrying me, but sort of empowering me in a way. Um, I've written about it. I've done an article in Sword which sort of précises what the book will be about, or some of it anyway, and it follows on from the chapter in my last book, Living the Life, and the chapter was on kingdoms and looking at the 2 kingdoms, and done a lot of research, and it's exciting, but it's also quite worrying as well. Excuse the dog behind me there. It's looking at what has happened in the world, and it's interesting that this word narrative keeps coming up, and I first saw this word in reference to the problems in the Middle East, where the Palestinians, they have their narrative, and which is basically just their version of the truth. So this word narrative, this whole idea of a narrative, is basically someone's version of the truth just presented on a silver platter as if it were truth, and it comes out of really Marxism, Karl Marx, communism, and this is where the story starts, because there are so many of these narratives going around, and with this era of false news and fake news and false truth and post-truth, it really is a case of various conflicting narratives all being created at the same time, that you choose or you don't choose to follow, depending on what part of the spectrum, the political spectrum you are, or how religious you are, or it's a case of just your version of the truth, and most of us are not quick to know which is true and what isn't, which is why the truth is so important for us Christians, never more so when there's this meddling going on. Cut a long story short, looking at the history of Marxism, obviously it's an economic theory by Marx, and it was about the workers of the world unite and rise up against your capitalistic bosses who are exploiting you. Well, the Marxists, those that followed Karl Marx, they fully expected during the First World War that the ordinary working man wouldn't fight the war. Instead, they would rise up together against basically be in revolution against their masters, and just refuse to fight. Well, obviously history tells us that didn't happen, and nationalism was still too strong in people's hearts to throw all that away, and so they were disappointed, and the only success they had was in Soviet Russia, or it wasn't Soviet then, but the Russian Revolution came along, and that became the first communist state. But meanwhile, these people, they were sort of left to seething, particularly the intellectuals among them, and there was a big group of them in Germany. Now, history has called these people the Frankfurt School, because that's where they were based in the 20s and 30s, and they were theoreticians, Marxist theoreticians, and what they wanted to do is they saw the failure of Marxism, and they said, okay, it's failed in that it hasn't been strong enough to make the working class rise up, so how do we spread its influence throughout all classes, particularly the middle class? So they redefined it. Basically, they brought in theories and techniques from other disciplines, notably psychoanalysis and Freud, and some bloke called Wilhelm Reich, who was a bit of a lunatic as far as I can see, and they created this thing called social or cultural Marxism, and the idea is that Marxism sort of jumped species from being an economic theory to a theory of culture. And this is where the story begins for us, and the problems begin, because of the Second World War, these people who were communists and or Jews were obviously not feeling very safe in Frankfurt, so off they went to America, and they found refuge in New York in Columbia University. which since then has a real reputation of being thoroughly infiltrated by, let's say, ultra left-wing thinking. And this is where it starts. It starts in the war years and after then, with this group of, let's say, these professors, these academics, their ideas, which were sort of bound up in this theory called critical theory, which is so complex. If you go to the Wikipedia page, it actually says this is too complex for most people to understand. But in layman's terms, it's a theory that basically says this is break down everything. In order to for Marxism to win, we need to break down the truths and the solidity and the foundations of Western civilization, which is the Judeo-Christian framework, and particularly the family. So they formulated techniques and strategies to break down the family and undermine Christianity, and it's been there ever since. And I'll carry on, this is going on for a bit long, so let's say this is very much part one. So in part one brings us up to the 1960s, where all the things we read about in the 1960s were interesting, but there's an undercurrent, and these people from the Frankfurt School, they were very much part of the undercurrent, and I'll pick up the story again then, and it's an interesting one, so hang around, speak to you soon.